First, former President Donald Trump winning the New Hampshire GOP primary in a head-to-head race with former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. The victory putting Trump one step closer to a potential third consecutive Republican presidential nomination. Here's Trump and Haley last night after the results.
This is an evening that I will not forget because it's the third time. But more importantly, I think it's going to be the most important time. We won both. When you win Iowa and you win New Hampshire, they've never had a loss. There's never been. So we're not going to be the first, I can tell you.
Now, you've all heard the chatter among the political class. They're falling all over themselves, saying this race is over. I have news for all of them. New Hampshire is first in the nation. It is not the last in the nation. This race is far from over. There are dozens of states left to go.
And there certainly are. Joining me right now, Trump 2024 Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. Karoline, good to see you. Your reaction to what you just heard and the results last night?
Well, frankly, Nikki Haley sounds delusional. She would probably fare better, Maria, in a Democrat primary than she currently is in the Republican primary. She was crushed in Iowa, coming in third place, and then somehow spun that as a victory. The American public are not buying it. And then last night in New Hampshire, she lost by a double-digit margin. As a matter of fact, only 29% of her voters yesterday were Republican primary voters. She does not have a chance to win in one single state in this Republican primary. And President Trump last night made history. He won more votes than any presidential candidate on either side of the aisle in New Hampshire presidential primary history. Nikki Haley is single-handedly preventing the Republican Party from unifying and taking the full force of this fight to Joe Biden and the Democrats. And that is because she is a vessel for the Democrats. She is a vessel for the Never Trump establishment movement. And her campaign, Maria, is funded by Democrat donors like Reid Hoffman, who are funding the witch hunts and lawsuits against President Trump right now.
Well, you've got Reid Hoffman, you've got other big business guys like Ken Langone, others who are behind Nikki Haley.
Right.
She's vowing to stay in the race despite the results last night. Her campaign says it's now shifting its focus to Nevada and South Carolina. She's also warning that Trump may have a harder time in her home state. Watch this.
Most Americans do not want a rematch between Biden and Trump. The first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the party that wins this election. When we get to South Carolina, Donald Trump's going to have a harder time falsely attacking me. Every time I've run for office in South Carolina, I've beaten the political establishment. They're lined up against me again. That's no surprise. But South Carolina voters don't want a coronation. They want an election.
Caroline, what about that? Talk to us about South Carolina. What's the campaign strategy? What is the Trump campaign expecting to see in that primary now, just a couple of weeks away?
Well, I'll tell you what South Carolina voters don't want, and that is Nikki Haley, who promised never to raise taxes on the great people of South Carolina when she was governor. She did raise the sales tax when she oversaw that state. She flip-flopped on her position on the gas tax as well, and then scrubbed her opposition to it on her website when she eventually ended up supporting it. Nikki Haley has also bowed to communist China. She sold South Carolina's farmland to the CCP, and as a matter of fact, the CCP, our greatest adversary in this world, doubled their investment in South Carolina when Nikki Haley was governor. And the top of mind issue right now for voters, as the exit polls proved last night, is immigration. Nikki Haley cannot be trusted on it. She supports open borders. She said that illegal immigrants are not criminals. That's a disgraceful statement to any American who sees the border invasion that we have ruining our country right now. She supports amnesty, and she was opposed to President Trump's border wall in 2016. President Trump has earned the endorsement of nearly the entire state delegation in South Carolina. The sitting governor is with him. Yeah. Both United States senators are with him. The only one who isn't with him, Maria, is Nikki Haley, and she'd be very wise to drop out before she gets beat in her own backyard.
Well, it's interesting what she said about the border crossers. I mean, just the fact that you crossed the border illegally, you've broken the law in the United States.
Definition.
So to say that they didn't commit a criminal act, Tiana, jump in here.
So congratulations on a truly dominant victory. Trump obviously drew up incredible margins with those very conservative voters. But you talk about uniting the party, saying that Nikki Haley is the one standing in the way from uniting the party against Joe Biden. Look, from the exit polling from last night, Nikki Haley won 61% of the independent vote to Trump's only 37%. We saw former President Trump being very conciliatory with his former opponents, like Senator Tim Scott, like Vivek Ramaswamy. Should we expect, if Nikki Haley were to posture to leave the race, that sort of concession and attempt to bring in her voters? Or does former President Trump not necessarily see those independents as a part of his winning demographic?
Well, first of all, 70% of Nikki Haley's voters last night were unaffiliated voters. Many of them, thousands of them, were formerly registered Democrats who switched their party affiliation in order to vote for her. And many of them were on camera speaking to news organizations yesterday saying that they won't be voting for Nikki Haley in a general election. They're going to be voting for Joe Biden. And so, yes, we will unify this Republican Party. President Trump has the majority of supportive Republican voters. And this argument that Nikki Haley is somehow more electable than President Trump is completely false. He is leading independents. He is beating Joe Biden in more head-to-head matchups than Nikki Haley is in a general election in November. That's why the Democrats are doing everything they possibly can to stop him, including weaponizing our Justice Department to try and remove his name off the ballot. Wow. And as I just said, the top issues for the American public right now, regardless of party affiliation, are immigration and the economy. And there's no one stronger on both of those than Donald Trump.
So let's talk about the VP, and that's expected to heat up after Trump's win last night. A list of names being floated, possible contenders, should Trump secure this nomination. We've been looking at a number, and people have been asked if they would consider joining him on the GOP ticket. Watch this.
So, Vivek, do you want to be vice president?
Look, I want to serve this country in whatever way I can, Jesse, but that's why I've been in this race since the first place.
Certainly, if the president asks, I would have to think about it because I want to help him however I can.
The only thing I want is 4 more years of Donald Trump and a Republican majority in the Senate, majority in the House, and the White House. And if I can help achieve that through my endorsement by being on the campaign trail in my home state of South Carolina for the next 4 or 5 weeks and then beyond, that's the goal.
I'm not getting into any conversations with President Trump, but I've said for over a year I'd be honored to serve in his administration in any capacity.
So, Karoline, what can you tell us? Who is Trump going to choose as his VP?
Well, Maria, I appreciate you curiously asking that question, but genuinely, we are steadfastly focused on wrapping up this primary. Hopefully, Nikki Haley will drop out soon so we can do that once and for all. And then focusing our attention and efforts on defeating Joe Biden in November. President Trump has said the most important quality for him is someone who would make a great president after he is out of office. It's his decision to make. Only he can do it. I'm sure it will be a great pick on behalf of the American people.
All right, Karoline, thanks very much. Good to see you this morning. Karoline Leavitt joining us. We'll be right back.